Welcome back. The Energy Regulator has consented to the transfer of Eskom Holding's powers and duties related to Section 34 of the Power Purchase Agreement with the independent power producers to the National Transmission Company South Africa in accordance with the Electricity Regulation Act. Now, in addition to this landmark decision, the Energy Regulator further sanctioned the issuance of a cost recovery letter to the NTCSA for Section 34 IPP projects and the amendment of the IPP's generation licenses to designate the NTCSA as the buyer in terms of Section 16(1)(d) of the Electricity Regulation Act, replacing Eskom Holdings in this role. The NTCSA's trading license will be amended accordingly. Well, let's try and make sense of this now. We speak to energy analyst Adil Nchabeleng. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us, Mr. Nchabeleng. What I've just read certainly sounds Greek to me and a lot of others who are not familiar with the laws and regulations. In simple layman's terms, what has happened and why is it groundbreaking?
What has happened actually is that the Energy Regulator has now licensed the new company called the NTSA. The NTSA means the National Transmission Company of South Africa, which will be responsible for buying electricity across the network, which means any producer of electricity, any generator, can now sell directly through the NTSA, bypassing Eskom as such, and Eskom will be regarded as one of the generators in the market, no longer now the buyer of last choice, whereby all the powers were vested previously in Eskom as a holdings company. And this is what has happened in terms of the groundbreaking news and change within the legislative environment. You know, some of us are still quite very skeptical in terms of this move in actually
Yes, you can go ahead.
Empowering the new company with the transmission network. Remember, Eskom's assets are based in three generation assets: transmission assets, which is the largest asset in the country, and then the last one is the distribution, where you have your base stations, as well as where they do the step down of electricity to municipalities, etc. So, you know, when you look at what has just happened, it's not a good move for South Africa. We completely caution against unbundling of Eskom for the same reason that now you're going to create a tariff crisis, which means we're going to be paying 2 to 3 times now the amount, because every entity now will have to charge its portion of the cost, whereas under Eskom it was all amalgamated.
So then what is the grand move behind this? Because the understanding from South Africans, just reading from the barrage of criticisms, and I'm pretty sure rightly so in some cases, or maybe in, you know, a significant number of cases, is that Eskom is completely dysfunctional. So is this a panacea to the Eskom problems, or as you say, that this will come with its own set of problems?
Look, Eskom will still be a major generator in terms of the country's biggest chunk of electricity producer. But what has happened is they've taken away major powers of Eskom, which means they could be the buyer as well as the distributor of electricity. Now the new NTSCSA will have to now be the almost buyer and seller of electricity, which means the company will be responsible for receiving electricity from Eskom, from other IPPs, as well as from other generators, and will be able to sell in the market. The problem with that model is it hasn't actually succeeded anywhere in the world. There's no model where you find an independent systems operator. They call them TSOs, you know, transmission systems operators, which has succeeded in a history, because electricity is not traded as a commodity. They are trying to create the commodity market for electricity trading, which means whoever sells at that point at a much more preferable rate will be given the preference, but not realizing that electricity in South Africa is generated and transmitted, as well as sold to the end customer, on the basis that we are subsidizing the economy. And that is why Eskom has been able to produce electricity at such a low cost. Now, you're going to include costs like transmission, costs like distribution in terms of base stations and everything. And that's just going to cause a huge amount of unnecessary cost burden to the consumer at the end of the day.
And I want to speak further on that. Often when we talk about IPPs in this country, they're also touted as our saving grace, because the juxtaposition is that you have this behemoth that is Eskom, that is steeped in bureaucracy and therefore is the cause of all of our problems because of corruption, etc., which people see as an inane part of governance, particularly in this country. But IPPs themselves, do we really understand the type of game changer that we're now going into?
Look, most of the people wouldn't understand, but we understand it at an analytical level, because one is IPPs are not going to be a game changer. It's hoped that until the next 10, 15 years future, there will be a change in South Africa's energy generation, not at the scale, at this stage. To replace Eskom, you need an equivalent capacity of electricity generation that can beat or rival Eskom. So far, there's no IPP in the country that has the capacity to even match what Eskom is doing. Most of the IPPs are stranded, are unable to connect to the transmission network, and they don't even have infrastructure, and it's not even going to be ready in the next 5 years. So, the projection that IPPs are going to be really big things is actually going to be a miss. It's going to be a huge disappointment to most people in the future, because the only one right now that is keeping this country going is Eskom. Those IPPs that we're talking about, less than 150 megawatts, are actually transmitted into the network. And to even transmit that, you need backup from Eskom with what they call gas peakers, for them to actually be moved into the network, because in order to make sure that they actually get transmitted on high voltage lines, you need a peaker to pick it up and then give it its frequency that is required in order to make sure that it can get into the network. So far, none of those dynamics are in place. So the major trader right now will be Eskom. And then what will then happen is there will be almost a lot of fraudulent selling of electricity that doesn't exist. People will be saying, we're connected to the network, we're selling this amount of megawatts and we want it transmitted to X amount of customer. For instance, in Messina, we're generating from the Western Cape or from the Northern Cape. But that electricity will never really enter into the network, nor get sold to the end consumer. So what would happen is there will be a trading desk like what they have created, which is the National Transmission Company.
All right, it's a pity we got cut off at that. Okay, I believe you are back with us, Adil. So you're just completing that train of thoughts that sometimes we could just end up with being sold electricity which actually doesn't exist.
Absolutely, because that's what's going to happen. Eskom will give you guaranteed electricity, but all the other producers of electricity cannot guarantee you, especially when it comes to low voltage, like your solar as well as wind, which is not stable and reliable. So whenever they tell you that you're going to be selling Eskom, it's very difficult for them to even transmit it into the network. So how are they going to be selling it to the end customer in Messina when it's generated in the Northern Cape? So this whole NTCSA is a big bluff, which is really just reapportioning Eskom's assets, moving it away from Eskom's books and putting it into an independent company so that they can allow for fraudulent trading of electricity to be happening under this new NTCSA.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us, energy expert Adil Nchabeleng.